Good evening. I'm Carrie Cronin, Assistant Library Director at York Public Library. We are pleased to welcome you to tonight's program, Working the Waterfront, Seafood Industry Adaptations, with presenters Mike Sinclair and Mike Masi, which is part of the 2025 Climate Change series titled Coastal Impacts and Resources. This series marks our fourth consecutive year of programming related to climate change in collaboration with York Ready for Climate Action and York Land Trust. Tonight's program is being recorded, and the recording will be accessible via the library's YouTube channel later this week. I will now hand things over to Kara Siglin, Programs and Communications Manager for York Land Trust, who will introduce tonight's presenters and moderate the Q&A. Thank you, Kara. Welcome.
Great. Thanks, Carrie. Welcome, everyone. Very glad you're here. I would like to introduce our two speakers for the evening. So we've got Mike Sinclair and Mike Masi. Mike Sinclair is a fourth generation fisherman, past president and current executive board member of York Lobstermen's Association, a longstanding member and former chairman of the Town of York Harbor Board. Then we've got Mike Masi, who's a former marine science teacher at York High School and founder of shell+claw, which is an organization aiming to diversify Maine's working waterfront through research and innovation. So we're going to go ahead. They've prepared a brief presentation, and then we'll have a Q&A session at the end. So throughout the presentation, feel free to drop your questions in the chat. We might answer some of them as we go, and the rest we'll save for any time we have remaining at the end. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Mike Masi.
Thank you very much, Kara. Just going to go ahead and share my screen. How did we do? Are we shared? A thumbs up or an A-OK? Yeah, we're looking good. All right. So, yeah, Mike and I actually, just to add a little bit more to the bio, we actually worked together. I worked for him on his lobster boat back in 2007 and 2008. So we'll be bouncing back and forth a little bit on this presentation, check and see if we still work well together and have that chemistry. And so I'm going to kick things off with a little bit of the science and some of the things that make the Gulf of Maine really, really unique. So we'll take a kind of a step back and look at, fisheries and the Gulf of Maine as a whole in this context of climate change, and then get down to some of the more details that affect us here in York. So this is a satellite, or this is just an image of the Gulf of Maine showing the bathymetry, the bottom contours. And what's kind of unique about the Gulf of Maine is that in many ways, it's almost like an inland sea, as opposed to just something that's part of the open ocean. The Gulf of Maine technically is extending here from Cape Cod up to the tip of Nova Scotia. But you see this, that it has a number of shallow spots quite a ways offshore, including George's Bank, a much smaller Browns Bank, and then getting up into what's called the Scotian Shelf, that kind of keep the water churning in that little kind of a kiddie pool within the larger ocean. And so historically speaking, this has been one of the most productive areas of the world's oceans when you talk about, the bounty of fish species that can be harvested from there. Overall, it's shallow. It's got some deeper spots, Wilkinson Basin, Georges Basin, but largely shallow, largely sunlit. There's a tremendous amount of nutrients coming from all the different rivers that feed into the larger Gulf of Maine watershed. And really importantly, it gets a lot of cold water inputs from the Arctic that have, determined what species live here. And, cold water species, ask any fisherman or anyone who enjoys seafood, they just taste so much better. And that's been a huge part of the success and the history of the Gulf of Maine. So moving on to this next slide, another thing that makes our area so unique is that there's really no place on the planet where you find quite the same temperature gradient over such a small area of latitude. Here we are in the Gulf of Maine, and you can see through this satellite imagery that the inputs of water are coming from the Arctic, working their way down around Labrador and Newfoundland, and then along Nova Scotia to go into the Gulf of Maine. But we do get some of this mixing with warm water from the Gulf Stream, running out from the Gulf of Mexico, heading over towards Europe to kind of bathe that area, nice warm water, keeping that whole climate actually habitable. But it is unique. The waters that come into the Gulf of Maine really have two different inputs. You've got a warm and a cold. And so the cold water is coming in from the Labrador Current primarily, and then there's some water that mixes along the slope, the continental slope that runs outside of Georges Bank and Browns Bank, and it comes in through a narrow channel over there. If I go back one slide, if I can, comes in right through this narrow channel and feeds into the Gulf of Maine. So we do get that mixing of water. And really importantly, in the context of climate change, the amount of water from each of these two different water masses has a dramatic effect on the temperature within the Gulf of Maine. And so I think it was 2018, there was a study done and published by Andrew Piershing, who is at the Gulf of Maine Research Institute. And it really, was a cause for some serious concern as they found that over the past decade, from 2006, 2007, up until 2016, 2017, the Gulf of Maine was warming faster than 99% of the world's oceans, and it certainly grabbed a lot of headlines. And that is true. That was accurately represented. But as I'll explain now, that we've seen that rate of increase in temperature, which was 4 to 5 times greater than the baseline rate at which the rest of the world's oceans were warming, that has not continued, thankfully. We wouldn't be boiling yet, but things would be really, really hot in the Gulf of Maine if that were to continue, for the past 8 years or going forward if we were continuing at that rate. So this slide is showing just the baseline rate at which the world's oceans are warming. That is this greenish line through here. And we're warming at a rate of about 0.29 degrees Fahrenheit per decade. And that rate of warming is and has been increasing. The Gulf of Maine, over this nearly 20-year period, 20-year period that we're in here, has been warming at a rate of 0.87 degrees Fahrenheit per decade. So nearly 3 times the rate, which is still very significant. But that Pershing article kind of captured, if you look real close at this data, from about 1980 into, 2007, 2008, when I was fishing with Mike, if you were to make a line of best fit there, it would be very, very similar to the line of best fit or the rate of warming for the world's oceans, okay? And then we have this pretty sharp increase from about 2006 through 2012, 2014 or so. Really, really quick change. And then if we go from, 2013 or so, with that variability we see that it's kind of plateaued out again. So what scientists think happened is that there was a bit of a regime change in terms of the waters filling into the Gulf of Maine. And that was captured very, very poignantly in the Piershing article in 2018. And the mechanism by which they believe this is happening and what they have observed is that the Gulf Stream has indeed migrated a little bit more north. It's kind of spread out a little bit, maybe showing some signs of slowing as well. But it has pushed north. And right here is kind of a critical pinch point, or an area that the scientists have highlighted. It's called the tail of the Grand Banks. It gets deeper there, but that was kind of the intersection between the cold Labrador Current and the warm Gulf Stream waters. And so what was prior to this shift, and these observations actually preceded the warming that we observed in the Gulf of Maine. Prior to that time that the Gulf Stream kind of migrated north, we had more Labrador Current water coming in around the tail of the Grand Banks, heading southwest, and then getting in through this northwest channel into the Gulf of Maine. It's kind of a simplification. There's a lot more to it because there is mixing of water here that happens along the continental slope. But generally speaking, we're seeing less of our cold water input and just a little bit more of that warm slope water coming in to the Gulf of Maine. Thankfully, And I just learned this last week, actually, took in a little webinar by a gentleman named Damian Brady, who's a climatologist and an oceanographer at UMaine. Thankfully, it seems that this is kind of a stable shift that has occurred, in that the Gulf Stream waters aren't necessarily turning off that cold water any more than it actually did in that 2008 time period. And that is largely because of the bathymetry, the underwater topography, off the Grand Banks and off of Browns Bank, and all this area outside the Gulf of Maine. So they don't think it's going to completely turn off the cold water inputs, but we hopefully have reached kind of a stable point where we're no longer going to be warming up, 3, 4 or 5 times faster than the world's oceans. We hopefully will maintain pace and not be warming at such an alarming rate. So a little bit of good news that we might get a little bit of respite from this really, really fast period of warming. And so with all this warming, we've kind of got 2 problems that we're seeing. One is more biological and a shift in species, but the other is about, having stronger storms, and this is related to climate change globally. But I'm going to let Mike pick it up here for a little bit and talk about some of the issues that we're seeing with infrastructure and some of the big storms we've had recently.
Good evening. Mike Sinclair. I was on the Harbor Board for 15 years, chairman for 5, and dealt with the Town Dock 1 being rebuilt. A lot of permitting over the years for different docks, and the issues that come up with the permitting and with the climate change issue of how things get permitted, and common sense doesn't prevail with common sense in permitting. So obviously, January 10th, January 13th storms, probably everybody's seen the pictures of them. There's a couple of pictures of some docks there. You can see one is the Sewell Dock by Sewell and Downell Dock by Sewell's Bridge underwater. Basically what happened was our infrastructure all throughout the town, where our commercial boats tie up to, which is Town Dock 1, Town Dock 2, private docks upriver, John Hancock Wharf, we were underwater by 1.5 feet, 2 feet. And with this climate change issue, with waters warming, storms become a little more prevalent, and they also become a lot more robust, to put it gently. But when these properties that we all work out of locally go underwater, it isn't just, water goes over the top and, you got to dry them out. You have lighting, you have wiring that gets inundated, it goes underwater. You obviously get roadways that go underwater. And then when it comes down to permitting this stuff to come back, there's a lot of hardship. There's a lot of different permits you have to get. There's a lot of different things at play. For example, at Town Dock 2, the building went underwater there, and you look to FEMA, you look to your insurance, you look to get paid, but you're a year to 2 years out. You need to have money sitting around so you can get these things up and running again. Fortunately for us in York Harbor, we have a pretty significant harbor fund there, so we can get things up and running again. But it's fighting to get these things afterwards and get the money, reimbursed back to you and what have you and stuff. Currently, when we permit or a dock gets permitted in York, you have to look at the highest astronomical tide mark, and you got to look at different figures, different things and surveys and stuff to find where the best spot for a dock is on a property. There's all kinds of standards. I'm not going to get into that. But for the longest time, we just went to the high astronomical tide mark, and that's what ends up happening is you permit a dock, and then it ends up going underwater because you're not looking to the future and looking to see that, our high astronomical tide mark is almost 12 feet in this town. There's different little survey things the government has off the coast, different areas, and ours is 11.97 feet. So that's just your basic baseline in high arsenical tide. That doesn't take in storm surge. That doesn't take in, the sea level rise coming in. I mean, there's no question that water level is rising. All you got to do is look at the Sewell's Bridge or the Wiggly Bridge Causeway. That thing is underwater 7-8 times a year. It was never like that 25, 30 years ago. You might have saw it once a year underwater. So there's no question water is coming in. So anyways, with these docks, when they get permitted, we're not making these docks are getting rebuilt and they're not elevated enough to look to the future. We need to be planning out 2050 and actually to 2100. State of Maine has a lot of good guidelines. Federal government has a lot of good guidelines. But some of the issues that I saw was they're guidelines. They're not directives. They're not saying, hey, you need to do this. They're letting the locals, come up with their rules, but you run into a lot of different politics with that. Nobody's saying somebody shouldn't be able to, rebuild a dock. It's just, you've got to make it resilient for the future. Town Dock 1, there was some pictures and stuff. I'm sorry if they don't pop up. When that went underwater in this February storm, in the January 10th, 13th storms, previously a year before that, in December 23rd, the dock was underwater then. So we started to repair the wiring, because all that wiring goes underwater. You repair it. A year later, it comes in again because we put it back to the same system that it was before, with not thinking, geez, these are going to happen. These are 25-year storms. We don't have to worry about kick the tide down the road and stuff. Well, a year later, we get 2 storms, put the wiring underwater again. So then you have to get insurance involved, FEMA involved. You got to get engineers involved. So thankfully, that dock has been rewired correctly this time. It's been raised up, but it's to the tune of $50,000 to do this type of things. That being said, I was probably one of the mistakes when that was planned out, because I was on the Harbor Board when the Town Dock 1 was originally planned and was rebuilt in 2011. And we just kind of kicked the can down the road. We didn't look at it long enough. We didn't look, at the science behind it and look to the future. We rebuilt it back to the same specs that were there before. This needs to be changed. The infrastructure needs to be changed. We got to be looking to the future with all these commercial structures. It's a important thing in the state of Maine to preserve our commercial fishing, and locally is as well.
Yeah. And I might just add that in these 2 storms, 60% of Maine's working waterfront was damaged, and it was some 70, $80 million worth of damage. So you do hope, as Mike was saying, that there's a little bit of forethought in terms of, the frequency of these storms they're no longer the 50-year storms. They're happening quite often. The highest ever tide recorded in Portland was I think on the January 13th storm. Kind of anecdotally, I also work as a caretaker on a property at the end of Rains Neck Road, hayfields right up to the ocean. The old caretaker, who was there for 42 years, told me about a big storm that he had to plow rocks back plow rocks off of the hayfields. He did it once in his 42 years. I've done it 4 times already in 7 years. So it's not the most scientific, but it makes a point. And of course, the storm he was referring to was the blizzard of 78. So these things are happening quite frequently. Estimates are 1.5 feet of sea level rise by 2050, 4 feet in the Gulf of Maine by 2100. It is time now to start planning for some of these factors that affect commercial fishing so much. Yeah. So, all right, now into the biology. I selected 3 species for Mike to shed a little bit more light on, so I'll put it on him, as he is the fisherman.
Sure.
Maybe to talk about cod, herring, and shrimp.
So as Mike said, we started off this presentation, water temperature is everything. It's especially water temperature is everything with lobsters and with shrimp as well. But lobsters are really, really dependent on water temperature. When you get over 50 degrees, lobster activity gets more prevalent. They start feeding, they get more active, they start moving along, doing their thing. Right now, water temperature is starting to go up. I mean, we were low of 38, 39 degrees. there through the winter time. Now we're up 42, 43, 44 degrees for the most part. Now, when you get to 43 degrees, I've been over my lobster deal and they have chillers in their tanks. Those are all refrigerated cold water tanks. And you put a lobster in there at 43 degrees, and they like to do that 43 degree for shipping because it makes the lobster very docile, ship them a lot easier. When you put them in a 43 degree temperature, they don't move. They're limp. They're hardy as hell, but they don't want to move. The metabolism slows right down. So as that water temperature gets warmer, those lobsters get more active. When you get to about 55 degrees or so to 60 degrees, lobsters want to shed. That's when we start targeting lobsters, is when they shed. Likewise, same time, about 55, 56 degrees, lobsters drop their eggs. And that, obviously, you introduce all that larvae into the water. That's your future. It takes 7 years for lobster to go from that larval stage until it's a 1 pound lobster. We're able to harvest it, 3 1/4 inch on their back of their shell that we can keep as a harvestable lobster. So as that's going on, water temperature is everything. Our biomass is, because of this warming trend, the biomass of lobsters, traditionally, we always fished up tight to shore. You were in 20 feet of water in the summertime, right up next to the shore. You could wave to us right from, the rocks off of long sands and the nubble and what have you. Now we're fishing a little deeper because those lobsters are finding those warmer, that water temperature they want to shed in or release their eggs in deeper water. A lot of guys are staying in 25, 30 fathoms of water, which is 150 to 180 feet of water. They're staying in those depths year round. They don't need to come in. That's depths tradition. We always fished in the late fall and early winter. Guys are staying in those depths now year round and not coming in because those lobsters, the biomass is staying more offshore for that. Likewise, and Mike's hit the graph on shrimp. Traditionally with shrimp, they were targeted end of December, January. They came in close to the shore because there was an optimal temperature they wanted, which was around 43 degrees to 44 degrees to drop their eggs. Again, that species would come in, they'd drop their eggs, and there'd be such a biomass. That's when your draggers, your shrimp trappers would start catching them up. Now, those shrimp are not coming near shore. They're staying in the deeper waters. They're not even coming. Used to be there was a fishery out on Jeffrey's Ledge in the deeper water. It was traditionally more of a March, April fishery after they left there. There's not seeing them in there as much. They're staying off deeper. They're staying in those areas where that water temperature they want to survive in is there. It's all water temperature dependent. Codfish, kind of an interesting species because we still see the codfish in those areas that they traditionally spawned in, off of the Wells Bay. There's some places off of Boone Island. They're always nursery of codfish. They're always spawning areas and what have you. But what happened to those is you don't see the large numbers anymore. You're never going to see the 60, 70, 80 pound codfish in a massive school. You might see 1 or 2 mixed in with a smaller school of fish, but you're never going to see those large codfish ever again. They've done a few studies on the cod, and they seem to be trending to a smaller species anyways. There's a little less herring around, a little less food for them, a little less, shrimp around, their traditional foods. They're not trending to be the large fish that we once saw. And again, they were eradicated pretty well and stuff. But lobstering in the Gulf of Maine is king now. There's a lot of places draggers can't go now because the lobster industry has taken it over with their traps and where they're setting. And Mike set the graph up there on that one. As you can see, lobster is king. 74% of the commercial species harvested was lobster. And Mike can attest. There's a little sliver out now for the aquaculture and the oysters and what have you. But lobster is still king, and it will be for years. There's been shifts. There's skies falling for a lot. There's uncertainty around it. Mike and I, we talked about that, and it's the uncertainty with the lobster is that everything has changed so much as far as expenses, an aging group of fishermen. I think the last age I saw, the average age for lobstermen in the state of Maine is 54 years old. I mean, I'm still on the young end, luckily, but it's getting close. But we're an aging fishery, and for our captains, and there needs to be younger people coming into it. There needs to be a future for them. But water temperature is definitely is king with those species there that I brought up and stuff. Mike, do you want me to go into lobster himself, or
no, maybe I'll just backtrack a second here and just kind of highlight and kind of bring it back to the theme of climate change. Yes, with codfish, like notorious example of overfishing. But species can bounce back from overfishing if the conditions are appropriate. And so, to the best of my knowledge, climate change and the changing temperatures in the Gulf of Maine have made it more difficult for spawning of cod, and therefore, we're not rebounding what was historically a very lucrative fishery. Herring, Atlantic herring, you're kind of on the south end of their range, and we've seen significant drops in the landings there in the state of Maine, although other species will filter in. Instead of having Atlantic herring, you've got pogies or menhaden that are, cyclical visitors to the Gulf of Maine, but, they've been in quite a bit more lately. And, just to touch on Maine shrimp, which I think is probably the tastiest thing you could take out of the Gulf of Maine. And Mike and I actually set some pots back when I was fishing with him. We didn't do too well, but we got some. That is a great case of overfishing combined with climate change to collapse what was a fishery. Like that was a pretty immediate and precipitous collapse. The spawning temperatures weren't really appropriate for the shrimp, but also because the water is warmed up in the Gulf of Maine, it made it habitable for this species that I put in under here, which is the longfin squid, which is a very significant predator of the Gulf shrimp, or the Gulf of Maine shrimp, the North Atlantic shrimp. So, to the best of my knowledge, they've opened the shrimp fishery back up for some experimental setting of traps and maybe some dragging too. Mike, I don't know if you know much about that, but I hear it's not going particularly well.
No, they did terrible. Basically, I don't even think a few of the guys had enough to make a shrimp cocktail.
Right. Yeah. Sounds like how we did.
Yeah, exactly.
But and if you look at the historic earnings from those types of fisheries, we're up around $12 million, across the board here. That, back in the 90s and in the 2000s, sometimes you had those other options. And now, to segue back a little bit more into lobster, really, like Mike said, lobster is king. It's really all we got when 75%, three-quarters of your value being landed at your ports is one species. That can be concerning. And Mike, maybe you could touch on it a little bit. Science is, people are always gathering data on this fishery, but what are the scientists seeing in terms of the movements or some of the hot spots in lobstering in the Gulf of Maine?
Sure. So obviously you look at the graph there, and you see everybody looks at 2016. That was our biggest year ever, 132 million pounds of state. And now we said it last year, 86 million pounds of state. Now there's a number of factors that come into that. 8 years time to get, lose almost 40 million pounds of lobsters. 2020, obviously pandemic. Guys, there was no price. There was no price hardly to go lobstering. Nobody was buying anything. You couldn't ship anything. Killed our price. Guys learned to adapt a little bit with that one. But with these, you look at the lobster landings and you look at like where we are now and stuff at that graph and value. Guys are fishing more efficiently now for what they're getting. We're getting a better price, so we're not having to fish as hard. I think the state of Maine had since 2020 was when we really started to do a lot of the mandatory reporting for numbers. They're figuring it's about 50,000 less trips per year that fishermen are taking. Now, when you look at 4,000 to 5,000 lobstermen, was it 4,400 fish in the state of Maine, right?
Yeah, I think so. I could move.
Something like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so you look at that and say, well, just call it 5,000 fishermen in the state of Maine, 50,000. That's 10 less trips that everybody made. You're trying to be a little more efficient because your price of your bait's gone up, your price of your fuel's gone up, your price of your lobster traps is gone up through the roof. A 4-foot lobster trap, when I get fishing, almost 30 years ago now, was $42. It's now $200 for that same lobster trap. And we fish pairs, 2 traps to a rope and the rigging with all the breakaway links and the buoys and all that. You have $500 into a pair of lobster traps now every time that you're pulling out. There's $500 on the end. We can fish 800 by law in the state of Maine. That's the most you can fish. You get 800 trap tags per year and stuff. So you get a significant investment out there with your gear at that type of price. So you got to make money. There's no question. So you got to be more efficient with it and stuff. So guys are letting the gear set a little bit longer. It's helping raise the value up a little bit more. You're not necessarily catching as much, but the value's gone up a little bit more. So at the end of the day, you're still putting about the same amount of money in your ass pocket, basically, than you were before of fishing 5-6 days a week. People are going 3 to 4 days a week and less trips. But there's been a change. But on your graph, though, is Mike pointed out, you got big spikes, but we're staying right now at a 85 to 132 million pounds in 2016. We're about 100 million pound a year per fishery on average now and stuff. Traditionally, years ago, back in the 80s, when I was a little kid sitting on buckets, banding lobsters for my father and family members, it was a 25 million a pound a year fishery. I mean, it was a quarter of what we're doing now. We've ramped up to that. That's where we're going to be at, I think. There is sky is falling as far as larval settlements and whatnot. But on our end of the state down here, where the drop has come on your lobster landings from 132 as a high to 86 million pounds, it's actually in your Knox, your Hancock County, your areas in your mid-coast Maine, your Penobscot Bay. That's the mecca. The Stonington, Maine is the mecca of lobstering for the state of Maine. And they're off down there by 25-30% on their catch and stuff. They had high years of 40-50 million pounds of just the county alone up there. And now they're sitting back at 20-25 million pounds of lobsters. Those are places there where that's all they have. I mean, we got a gentleman class of fishermen down here compared to up there. I mean, they've got harbors with 200 lobstermen, and a downturn like that is very significant for them. But is a fishery where we're sitting pretty good. I mean, the sky is, people pull this, sky is falling type of thing. We weather through it. You deal with it. You look at the numbers and stuff, and we deal with these things. But this town of York, traditionally, I pulled some numbers on like 2015, 2016 when we did the dredging, and we were about 700,000 pounds is a town of York catching for lobsters. 700,000 pounds. You don't think as much, but we only catch about 3.5 to 4 million pounds per year just in York County. So we're catching 20-25% of the lobsters caught in the southern Maine portion of the area. It's a sustainable, because when you look at your graphs on what you're catching, your community, your county and stuff, the southern Maine area just stays flat. There's very little movement. We just catch about the same for the last 25 years. It pretty much just stays even right across the board. We're not seeing these precipitous drops up and down like you're on mid-coast. We'll be stable. We'll be okay in this end of the state.
Yeah. Do you think that could be, I mean, you go up into mid-coast and you get lobstermen are able to fish in estuaries. York River is actually one of the few places, as far as the river is concerned, that we are not allowed to set traps.
That's right.
The temperature variability that you're going to see up in those estuaries is going to be greater, just trying to tie it back to climate change. So we have an easier time here, I think, of getting into some of those consistent water masses just a little bit deeper than you would if you're fishing in Casco Bay. Casco Bay, the past couple of years, has been terrible
That's right.
absolutely terrible. And I think that could largely be temperature dependent.
Yeah, the same thing. Piscataqua River. Those guys used to catch lobsters right up by Newark's, up in Dover, over
Yeah.
in there and stuff. And there's very little lobster activity now. They wade off the harbor now and stuff. They don't go up in there. It's too warm in those estuaries.
Right. And so we are kind of sitting pretty good. But while we're here and still on lobsters, like, York Harbor, I think when I pulled some numbers, has somewhere between 30 and 35 lobstermen licensed. I know that number's dropping. If you could, look into your crystal ball and predict 25 years from now, my son is the youngest commercial lobsterman in the town at age 11. What would he be looking at when he's, 35 years old?
Probably a lot more wide open bottom, that's for sure. There's not the guys going into it. There's not people going into it. My boys are 26 and 25. They fished with me, decking for me. But I told them when they were growing up, if you don't love this, you don't want to get into this, because you don't want to become 30 years old, 35 years old, starting a family and go, well, you know what? This really isn't for me. Maybe I want to do something else. Maybe I should have done something else. So unless you love this business, I tell everybody, you got to make the commitment to it. You got to love the early mornings, the long days. It's a lot to this business, the commercial fisheries. What I see down the road, Mike, is eventually we're going to get a level like currently now. When somebody retires, that license just goes into a whole big pool, and our state is broken up into 7 different zones, and we're zone G. We're the lower end, the 7th zone down in the state. And what happens now is that license basically goes back into a big pool, and when it goes in that pool, they take how many trap tags you had. So if you retired and you only had 200 trap tags, well, that doesn't do nothing. So you need not just a certain number of fishermen to retire, you need a certain amount of traps to come out of the water before a new fisherman comes on. That's why you start hearing about wait lists and with lobstering, like guys spending 12, 13 years on wait lists, because it's not only a certain amount of licenses you need to retire, you need a certain amount of traps to come out of the water before new ones come in. To me, in the town of York, we're at a level right now that's very sustainable, and I would love to see something where our licenses stayed within this town. So if somebody wanted to come in, that fisherman leaving could sell that license to that next person coming in, mentor them along, and and keep a fishery going. I don't know what the future is going to bring. There's been a lot of different proposals over the years about selling licenses to try to help the newer ones coming in, because what will end up happening is, and that's what's happening like in the Stonington, Maine areas, a lot of people get into it. You get a whole rush of fishermen that got in because they got in under the junior program, and you got a lot of guys now that are splitting up the pie, and their numbers are going down, and it's starting to become very, very, a lot of hardships up in those areas now.
Yeah, interesting. That's all good. I mean, just looking at the data here, kind of wrapping up, you do see the number of harvesters in lobstering is dropping over time, and just kind of to tie it in while we're on this slide, you're seeing the same thing in softshell clams. Those 2 fisheries have typically supported the most harvesters in Maine, and we are seeing a drop in both. And I'm not saying climate is all to blame for this, but as you'll see with soft clams in a second, it's definitely implicated.
Mike, we had a quick question just
Yeah.
the previous slide.
Throw it out there.
From Mark. He was just wondering, will less dragging allow cod to recover? You touched on it about shrimp.
There's already no dragging going on. All the dragging is basically George's Bank, some deeper water. The Gulf of Maine, for the most part, there's a lot of lobster gear all over, from here to Jeffries. And the other side of Jeffries, you get a little bit of dragging. But codfish, dragon's not the issue now. Is that species was brought to the brink of extinction in the Gulf of Maine, and it's going to be, there really shouldn't even be a recreational fishery now for codfish. Put it that way. And I love cod. I'd love, I love try to catch one a year and stuff and eat and what have you. I love it, but there really shouldn't even be a recreational fishery right now.
Yep. Interesting. And one more thing about, as we're talking about York Harbor lobstermen, some of the folks that I've talked to, and just the lack of diversity we have in our fisheries, there are a lot of fishermen in York and statewide that are, in their 50s, 60s, 70s, and they have done nothing but fish lobster their entire life. That paid the bills. And, you can see it on this graph here that they were there for the lobster boom. Um, in talking to some of them, talk to Mark Sewell and his son Sam, who's my business partner, they think it's probably unlikely that we'll see a generation that can be entirely reliant on one species. And so, my business partner, as I just said, is Sam Sewell. He's 27 years old. Um, the reason he's interested in working with me is so he can diversify what he does, so he doesn't have all his eggs in that basket of lobster. Because if something happens, whether it is continued climate impacts or regulation or what have you, price of all the traps, the bait, and all those types of expenses, it's good to have another species that you can go ahead and target. And that's what fishermen through the 80s and the 90s and prior to that had those options. And right now that's something that I think is really scary about fisheries, in particular in York. The commercial fishing in York is almost entirely lobster. And as we were talking, if just those licenses go away just due to attrition and these guys, we have an aging fleet of captains, once you lose those boats from the harbor, then those become recreational boats, and in the commercial aspects are probably not coming back. You think that's fair to say, Mike?
Well, if you don't have commercial activity, you don't get dredged as a harbor either. And so
Yeah,
there's
true.
the fine line with that, where you have to have commercial activity to even step in line for the Army Corps of
Yeah.
Engineers to even fund you.
And it's also part of, for me, it's part of the character of our harbor, the character of our town, the character of our state. So all those things are factoring in. But maybe enough about lobster. There are potential species coming, into the Gulf of Maine, and we just have to look south of the Cape to see what is possible. These are not anywhere near commercially viable populations yet, but we've got a blue crab that Mike caught, actually a few blue swimming crabs.
I've gotten five over the
Here.
years.
And then we've got black sea bass. Maybe there could be a fishery for longfin squid, like we talked about, and menhaden and things like that. Now, what my company has focused on has been green crab and selling green crab as soft shell crab. And this is very tied to climate because green crab, and I'll just go ahead and play this video as I talk about it. Green crab is an invasive species, originally from Europe that have been here for 200 plus years. But because Maine used to have significantly colder winters, a good hard freeze up into the estuaries would knock the population back. We all know that our winters have been much more mild. This winter was kind of reminiscent of something from the 80s and 90s, but we'll see what it does to the green crab population. And so they've absolutely exploded, and green crab are a very dominant predator of soft shell clams, steamer clams. So we can see that as we started to get warmer and warmer winters through the 80s and into the 90s, the harvest of soft shell clams has dropped significantly. And as I mentioned, it was historically Maine's second most lucrative fishery. So this time lapse that you guys just watched is 2 hours worth of fishing in Brave Boat Harbor, where we have part of our operation, and just a bait bag with some herring in it, and 2 hours there. We caught about 30 pounds in that trap just to show their abundance. So that was 300 to 400 crabs crawled into that trap in that small time period. So the abundance and the biomass of green crab is absolutely remarkable. When there's that many hungry mouths in an estuary, it's hard to imagine that much else can survive. And they're tearing up eelgrass beds, which sequester nitrogen and carbon. They dig and burrow into the sides of the marsh bankings, which leads to increased rates of erosion. Those marsh bankings themselves, that peat that's contained in those marshes, holds tremendous amounts of carbon, protecting uplands from the storms and the increased sea level rise. All those really important things. So this species is a huge nuisance for which we have very little value, very little economic benefit to go in and harvesting them. I don't need that. Let's see. There we go. So My company is all former students of mine that have helped out over the years and been interns. And so what we do is we catch green crabs in huge, huge numbers, and then we separate out the males that we believe are gonna molt for us. And it takes some training. You gotta train your eye, and you gotta see a fairly subtle. As Mark will attest to, he came and sorted with us for a little bit one day. Um, you're looking for a very subtle morphological cue on the underside of the crab that indicates it's going to molt. And then we put them in specially designed gear we call crab condos. And then we check the condos actually twice a day during the molting season. And again, just like Mike said, temperature is everything, particularly with crustaceans and their molts and their release of eggs. When we do check our crab condos, if we see what appears to be two crabs, this is actually the live crab animal, and this is its discarded exoskeleton. So they get quite a bit bigger, like a third larger with each molt. We take them out of the water so that their shells stop hardening, and then we bring them to restaurants. They can stay alive for about a week, refrigerated in that soft shell state. You can fry them up and consume them shell and all. So they're actually really, really delicious. And the reason that you want to do these as soft shell is because it's a fairly small crab, maybe 3.5 inches across its carapace, really hard shell, a picking market, which some are trying to sell. I don't think will ever get established. But as a soft shell, they're really delicious. We have a first of its kind green crab slash oyster farm that we're going to get started this year in the York River after 3 years of going through the permitting process. So we have a 0.97 acre lease that's across from the golf course. This little rock here is Ram's Head Rock, and we've snugged it in into that little cove between what's called the Elizabeth Perkins mud flat over here and Ram's Head Rock here, and it's just in that bend in the river around the golf course. So if you're kayaking, paddling, or fishing in the river, starting this spring, probably in May, you're going to start to see some gear appearing in this area. We're going to run our green crab operation from May through early July. And the timing of that is great because after the green crabs are done molting, that's when oyster farmers get their oyster seed here in Maine. And so in early July, the green crab gear will come out, and then the oyster gear will go in, and we'll use the same kind of long line system to house our baby oysters in their first year of growth and development. And then, so that's kind of where we're going with our company. And just a quick segue into aquaculture in general. And so aquaculture is definitely a way to keep people working, keep the working waterfront engaged and still productive, even if we see some of these dips in wild caught fisheries that we have seen due to climate and overfishing, and maybe insulate things a little bit for the lobster fishery. There's about 200 farms statewide, and those would be standard leases or experimental leases. And then there's, I think, around 450 what are called LPAs, limited purpose aquaculture licenses. And those are just for small scale ventures that are probably looking to shop an area and see if it's suitable and grows a nice oyster so that they can apply for eventually a standard lease. So about 700 year-round employees, maybe 100 million in sales, but increasing steady growth in many areas of aquaculture, whether it's salmon farming, kelp farming, or what we're looking to do is growing oysters. And so I've got the landings data here for oysters, and you can see that it is trending upwards. And importantly, about 1 in 6 sea farmers are also holding a commercial lobster license. So it's showing you that folks in the lobster industry are aware of, potential challenges in the future and very much looking to diversify what they do. And so with that, we're 3 minutes past where we wanted to hit for a 6:50 going into Q&A. So hopefully we left 7 minutes here for anybody who's got some questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we'll toss it back to Kara.
Great. So we had another question from Mark. What are your thoughts with regards to the relicensing of the dams on the Kennebec and migratory fish species?
Yours, Mike.
Give me that question one more time. I was kind of fiddling. What are my thoughts on the relicensing of dams?
On the Kennebec, dams on the Kennebec and migratory fish species.
These dams are for hydropower. Is Mark available to speak?
I would assume.
You guys can unmute. I'll tell you right now, I would need to look into it more so. I do know that, as we've broken down dams and deregulated dams and put in fish ladders and all these types of things, they have been beneficial for the alewife fishery, 100%. And so, yeah, you got these diadromous fish that go up into fresh water to spawn and then live, their lives out in the ocean. And, whether it's Atlantic salmon, alewives, or blueback herring, it doesn't matter. These dams did a significant amount of damage, and it's been slow to recover from that. Kennebec, that's a huge river system, and I'm sure that it will, without putting significant effort into fish ladders and other remediation, I think it would be a real hit to the wild populations.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Frank. I think you have to put so much money into the fish ladders to balance everything out. I don't know if the cost would be hard, but hydroelectric, I mean, it is nice because it's sustainable.
And that gets really to the heart of the conversation here. It's, we're balancing. It's all a balancing act, whether you're talking about hydropower or you're talking about wind power in the Gulf of Maine. You gotta, do your very best with the amount of information you have to make a sound decision. Obviously, I support commercial fisheries, but I'm a firm believer that climate change is a very significant challenge to these fisheries. The rate of change that we're experiencing is, well, I mean, one, it's not sustainable, and to be always playing catch up and having lack of stability in our fisheries is a significant challenge. So you got to tackle the root of the problem, and we probably should have started doing that 20, 30 years ago.
Great. Our next and the final question that we have in the chat is from Susan. As new fish species move northward due to ocean warming, are efforts being made to change state quotas for catching each species?
Well, as Mike pointed out, black sea bass, those blue crabs, those are the blue crabs that you see them catch down in Maryland. It's the ones that, again, it's a soft shell. They eat them hard as well. There's just not the numbers yet that are making around, Cape Cod Bay into the Gulf of Maine yet to be a commercially viable species. That being said, I'll tell you this, is black sea bass is delicious. It's a real nice buttery flavor. Can't say about the blue crab, haven't had that yet, but they're excellent. I hope that we can make some changes, but they're not commercially viable yet.
And
well, as a Marylander myself, I can vouch for blue crab, and it makes me very excited. Well, sad and excited.
And as a Mainer who's had blue crab, green crab is better, more flavor. You just have to put 2 crabs back to back to fill out a bun, just in case Carol was wondering. But I think that's a fantastic question. I think you'll find that regulators, whether it's NOAA fisheries, are going to be a little bit behind on that as we start to see, what commercially viable populations look like. Things will start recreationally. Like, I don't know about tautog as a species south of the Cape that's, has a fishery and very big recreational sport fish. Do we have any rules and regulation on that? I don't think so yet, but I've seen them and they're coming. And so that, yeah, it's, one thing we didn't hit and we kind of touched on, but, fishermen, recreational or commercial, it's a good time to be nimble and maybe a little bit creative.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you to Mike Masi and Mike Sinclair for presenting this evening and sharing your knowledge with all of us. I'm looking forward to trying the green crab. It sounds great. And thank you, Kara, for moderating. I really appreciate it. Before we say goodnight, I just wanted to remind everyone that about the next programs in our climate change series. We have one coming up on April 9th, which is coastal tourism and sustainability, and then a program on helping coastal towns to adapt to climate change on April 23rd. And our final event will be an invasive plant removal work day at Fuller Forest Preserve in York on April 29th. So I hope to see you for some of those upcoming events. Thanks again, everyone. Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
You all. Thanks.